you everyone for coming. We're going to start our lecture here. I'm Jim Souza, Preservation Society of Fall River, and the lecture is on the Olmsted Parks of Fall River. In the early 20th century, as you can see around this entire park, there's a lot of tenement buildings, a lot of mills, a lot of people, and they had no yards and stuff, so they created parks not just in this city, but in many big cities, Boston, New York City, Chicago, to give people a recreational spot and a place to enjoy their time with their families when they could. Again, being such congested cities, that this open space was kind of important then, and as well as it is now. I mean, here, this being designed in the early 20th century, this is one of the reasons this particular part of the park was built, to give some shelter to maybe music or dancing, or today we're using it for this. I mean, luckily we didn't have rain like we had this morning, but that's pretty much why they had the parks in the city. We were lucky enough to have three. South Park, this is South Park, which is now Kennedy Park, Ruggles Park, and North Park, designed by Olmsted and his children. I have a little paper that I read. John Church is our lecturer. He has a long list of accomplishments and education. I just want to read it. I would never remember it, so I did type this up. John Church is an award-winning architectural and landscape historian, a writer, and a teacher. John received his MA in 1986 in architectural history and historic preservation from the School of Architecture, the University of Virginia. His 30-plus year career in preservation has brought him across the globe to study historic landmarks and landscapes. He also advises on historic preservation projects and has entered the world of historical fiction writing inspired by his travels. His latest books included America's Eden, Newport Landscapes Through the Ages, and The Artful City, which received the Victorian Society of America Book Award in 2021. I'd also like to thank at the moment the City of Fall River and Viva Fall River for sponsoring this lecture. And I would like to introduce you to John Church.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Very good. I hope I don't blast you out of the pavilion. Well, what is a park? A park is a place of assembly, and a park and a garden is meant to be a recreation of heavenly paradise on earth. But what about the history of the public park and how this fits into it? You know, green spaces did not exist in cities in Europe for centuries. They were all hardscape. But in the middle of the 18th century, we really owe the British credit for developing the idea of the publicly shared green space. Some of the earliest green spaces open in England were Hyde Park, St. James Park. They were royal hunting grounds, opened by the monarchs. The Jardin des Tuileries, the garden right in front of the Louvre, was a royal garden, only open to the public in the 18th century. So you have this burgeoning interest in the late 18th century in green spaces in the city and the cult of the tree as the very center of a landscape. If you go to earlier palaces in Europe, like Versailles, that garden has no business growing, as we say. Every tree is clipped, it's green architecture. Every hedge is clipped. In the 19th century, with the rise of the Romantic movement in literature, art, painting, the notion of the shadowy, misty, ancient grove rises in popularity. And so the tree and tree collecting and the idea of a park as an arboretum begins to emerge. And the Scottish writer named Loudon wrote about an arboretum as both a scientific and an aesthetic collection of trees. So you begin to have this understanding of what a park could be. And then enter Frederick Law Olmsted. He first began, and he becomes the great park maker in the United States, really the pioneer of the whole profession of what would come to be called landscape architecture, the way we shape our world. But you know, he didn't start out that way. He started out as a journalist, and that's an important part, believe it or not, of his landscape designs later on, because as a journalist, he had to observe everything. His most famous articles were traveling through the American South before the Civil War, talking about the social conditions of the time, but with that keen journalistic eye, he observed everything. topography, plants, trees, buildings, and the way people move about, the way people behave. So the social part and the design part and the horticultural part all will come together in his park designs, and that's what makes them so special. He had a farm for a while. That venture failed, so he had a few false starts. Then he meets Calvert Vaux, spelled V-A-U-X, who was already a prominent architect. In the 1850s, he was designing summer houses in Newport, which was arising as a fashionable summer resort. He was based in New York. They applied in the competition for Central Park. They won that competition in 1858 with their greensward plan. Vaux was the famous one at the time. They joined forces, they won over many different competitors, and many of the competitors wanted to design a formal park, like the great classical parks of Europe around the great palaces, straight paths, straight rows of trees, grand sculpture, grand fountains. What does Olmsted do? He designs the green spaces, and Vaux designs the architecture. If you've been to Central Park, he designs Bethesda Terrace, the great stone terracing overlooked the ponds. He designs all of the various garden pavilions you come upon through the park, but all of the curving paths, this picturesque idea. The picturesque, as opposed to the classical is based on straight lines, long formal views. The picturesque movement in park design, which Olmsted masters, is all about the curve and all about the asymmetrical placement of trees. So you have these sight lines cutting through these groves of trees, but it makes you want to wander. It draws the viewer in. You actually don't know what is at the end of the path. So he designs one large meeting field, number one, always key. And I'm pointing this out to show you, to show us how it plays out in South Park and in the Fall River parks, because Central Park makes Frederick Law Olmsted a star, an absolute national celebrity. So you have a grand meeting field for the public, and then on the perimeter of the park, you have all of these tree-lined paths. Then you have a great pond, then you have cliffs, and then you have, really important, what's called the distant view. Frederick would design a green space, but no, what is beyond it can be capitalized on. And remember, Central Park is a very long, long strip of land. He designed carriage paths as well as pedestrian paths, and his ideal was that people from all walks of society would be in a park. Again, before this time, if you think of early green spaces in this country, they were usually gated. If you know Beacon Hill in Boston, Lewisburg Square is a green park, but it has a gate around it, and only homeowners have the key to go in that gate. Most of the London squares started out as private gardens. So you see, there was no mixing in life. These great parks were designed for that. He then, when Central Park is beginning to be finished in the 1860s, he officially forms the company Olmsted and Vaux. 1871, they received the commission for this park. So South Park really is in the early days of his triumphant firm, in his early career. And they will design this very much in the spirit of Central Park. If we look in this direction, and we can use this as our image, long narrow park, but sited, of course, you originally had a large green space, a playing field. The baseball fields are there now, but it was one open field, and the perimeter of the park was surrounded by 3 rows of trees. So you had a wall of greenery around the park. Then you have the reflecting pool, and then this pavilion. And again, it's a very organic pavilion. Rough-hewn fieldstone, shingles. Even the arches don't even have any elaborate framing around them. So it's meant to be this open-air pavilion, and it's all about the view in this direction. And Olmsted, in his letters, writes about the majestic views from here. It reminded him of the Hudson River. We may be looking out onto a bay, but it reminds me still of that kind of setting. If we speak about Olmsted's love of the distant view, this is what you have here. And the pavilion is placed just on the precipice as the topography goes down. And he loved the view of Mount Hope Bay and then upwards to the Taunton River. Olmsted talked about what he called the genius loci, the genius of the place, and you work with that. And he really is one of the first park makers who you could call organic. By that I mean he didn't blow up the earth. He didn't do a lot of regrading, only when necessary. So he wanted to respect the natural topography. I feel that's where we go back to his journalistic eye. He would study every inch of a landscape as it was. Now, the trees in this period, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and here we have Fall River, an industrial city, with steamships and what are called Wardian cases, these basically small glass greenhouses. Plant collectors could get around the world even faster. So you start to have a huge variety of plant material beginning in the 1840s and 50s. And so Americans and well, anyone can collect orchids, ferns, palms. And so early 19th century gardens could be very colorful. Huge beds of begonias, geraniums, hydrangea can be quite beautiful. Olmsted did not advocate for that. He advocated for a much more restrained approach. He liked broad playing fields, a variety of trees. He did warn against having a monoculture of only one kind of tree, concerned about disease, which could wipe out only one variety. And it was the taste of the time to have a variety of trees. And Olmsted described himself like a painter. He once said, and I paraphrase, but he said, "My clients have to trust me because a building can be built in a few years, but my landscape will take 25 years to 30 years to mature. So they have to trust my vision and know that like a painter, he would approach the landscape in terms of color and texture. So when you have deciduous leafy trees, that's one kind of texture. When you have fir trees, evergreens, they actually absorb light. And then other types of trees like wall shrubs, let's say holly, shiny leaf trees reflect light. So that really describes the way a painter would create a canvas. And so in this case, he makes sure he leaves an open space here so a pavilion can have the magnificent view. Then you go down the landscape, and if you notice the treescape, even this very mature treescape, doesn't obscure the view of the water beyond. This is a great triumph for the city in the 1870s. And then Olmsted will go on, and not only is he a celebrity, but his work begins to be supported by the leading writers of the day. There was a woman with a very 19th century name, Mariana Griswold van Rensselaer. I mean, I wouldn't take on someone with that name. Old New York family, she summered in Newport, and Frederick was working on 4 projects in Newport. And she was a writer, really the most regarded architectural critic of the time. And in the 1880s, she began to write for Garden and Forest. And at that time, Frederick was working for the Vanderbilt family at a house called Rough Point. They were the original builders of it. Frederick wanted to have a meadow tended by sheep going down to the sea. Rough Point literally sits on granite outcroppings in this one of the southernmost parts of Newport. The Vanderbilts were thinking of a more formal garden. It became a national debate, the fame of the Vanderbilts, the fame of the fashionable summer resort. And she wrote she hoped the Vanderbilts would respect Olmsted's more naturalistic approach. They didn't in the end go for the sheep, but they didn't go for the formal garden. They went for an undulating landscape that respected the natural flow of the land and all of the granite outcroppings as well, which pepper the site. They didn't blast those, they kept them. And he planted pine and beech roses and really what we could call natives that respected the site. One of the earliest advocates of native plant material. So that's in the 1890s, right? He begins to work with his sons who were growing up by that time. He did have many firms. He had Olmsted and Vaux. Then he had Olmsted, and Elliott. That was himself, his 2 sons, Frederick Jr. and John Charles, and a young man called Charles Elliott, whose father was a prominent art historian at Harvard, old Boston family. His father was a professor of Renaissance art. Charles was imbued with European artistic traditions, very well versed in all types of landscapes and gardens. He worked with Frederick on what's called in the park system in Boston, which is nicknamed the Emerald Necklace. You have Boston Common, the ancient common, the public garden, one of the earliest parks in the country, that's about 1838. But then he designs the row of trees on Commonwealth Avenue, and then the whole Fenway system, the Fens, and then that links to Franklin Park. So a person could walk from downtown Boston all the way out to the countryside. So Charles Eliot works with him on that. They then received the commission for a house called Ochre Court in Newport. It was one of the first of the grand palaces in the town, 1891, by Richard Morris Hunt, who was also designing the base for the Statue of Liberty in New York. They designed actually a classical garden, a formal garden, set in a picturesque park. So what they were proving is Olmsted is famous for this kind of picturesque design, but he and his sons were very adept at designing in any style for that house. Sadly, Charles Eliot died at only the age of 30 in Florence of a fever. He had become ill. So the sons reconfigure as Olmsted brothers. Frederick, still beloved by the Vanderbilts at least, goes down to Biltmore in North Carolina and helps George Washington Vanderbilt design his estate, which originally was over 40,000 acres. Now, it's not a 40,000 acre garden, but he designs the grand grounds around Biltmore House, and then with a man called Gifford Pinchot, who would eventually help begin the National Park Service and help craft the whole public park system during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, helps figure out the Pisgah National Forest and other parks that would evolve, forest, wilderness parks from that project. Then they come back to Fall River. North Park, 1902-1904, as Olmsted brothers. Frederick dies in 1903. Right? So many times people can mistake an Olmsted Brothers park for a Frederick park, but you know, it doesn't matter. The sons were brilliant. They worked in their father's manner. They did embrace some classical designs as well around the early 1900s when grander mansions were being built, but they continued this. North Park is an interesting story because by 1900, Fall River has a proper parks commission. Many cities did. We're in the progressive era by the early 1900s, and there's greater lobbying for reforms, democratic reforms in American life, and the expansion of public park systems in a consistent way was now the order of the day, not just the occasional green space funded by a private donor. And so the Olmsted brothers were very busy with what we call improvement plans for cities. Urban planning meets scenic vista preservation and traffic congestion, that new thing called traffic congestion. They did a plan for Newport. In North Park, they didn't like the site, believe it or not. They didn't like the site. They felt it had great views, but it was too hilly. They had to work with it anyway. It's a brilliant park design. What they couldn't have in North Park were the carriage paths. If you know Fall River, you know the park, it's extremely steep. But they loved the dramatic views. They actually did they didn't regrade North Park, but they partly reshaped it because some of the areas were so steep you couldn't even walk on it. But they did like the great views. And they noticed that on one side of the park was the Highlands District with high wealth residents, and then the tenement neighborhoods below in the north end of the city. So they did the entire park as a link between all those districts, which were once separated by this sort of brush-filled, thorny, a little bit of a wilderness that the land around North Park was composed of. It's a very distinctive park, again, because of the steepness. It goes down almost like a roller coaster. So they worked with that. They also received some smaller but very important commissions, Durfee Green as it's called, the small triangular green space, which is often considered sort of a gateway to the Highlands area, to create a green shaded area between all of those houses. They also later, just a few years later, received a commission to work on the Rose Hawthorne Lathrop nursing home grounds. The Catholic Church owned it. Rose Hawthorne, a member of the Hawthorne family, eventually converted to Catholicism. She entered the convent, and many nursing homes were named after her for her good works. So that was a key commission, and that also led to the redesign. It was a small landscape plan, but important, around St. Mary's, the Roman Catholic cathedral, and then also the first congregational church right across from right near the old Durfee High School. So they worked at both religious sites, parks, Ruggles Park as well. So 3 parks, Rose Hawthorne Nursing Home. So a total of eight projects here in Newport. Frederick establishing the reputation, and then the sons continuing with it. The parks really are the bookends of the city. This in the south end, the other in the north end, just by the nature of their location. One thing they didn't do, there's no plan for it, but they would have envisioned it to have a green parkway connecting, a green tree-lined drive connecting the 2 parks, because that's what they did do in Portland, Maine. The Olmsted firm designed a park in their east and west ends, and then what we call the parkway. That was Frederick Olmsted's vision, to design these long tree-lined and also grass-stripped boulevards to create humane, pedestrian-friendly walking zones. The Olmsteds also did what we would call early suburban development. Now, this is pre-car suburbia, but Frederick Olmsted moved to Brookline, Massachusetts, and lived next door to the renowned architect Henry Hobson Richardson, who, for example, designed Trinity Church on Copley Square in Boston and several other buildings. They've often worked together, Frederick designing landscapes. And Frederick was really aware of this notion, working with architects, of these burgeoning new residential communities, and he wanted to design them like Old English villages. Rather than just dividing land up like a grid and letting houses develop, it was the idea of the pocket development. One street leading into the neighborhood, and then a circular road with houses placed in an asymmetrical way. So when you drive in, you're not even seeing many roads. You're seeing houses placed in what really is like a shared parkland. And that becomes a template for American communities across the nation. Other well-known architects began to do this. For example, in Newport, Rhode Island, in the mid-1880s, Frederick designed a road system for over 365 acres of land in the Ocean Drive area, where he designed the roads to respect, again, the local topography of hills, and he designed the roads for their scenic views. And he talked about these rolling hills and the precipices you find. And so he said, he called it the art of scenery, the art of scene making. So first you come, you look at the topography, you look at the distant view, and you start from there. You start from the big picture, and then you work down to the little details. That's sort of the magic of what he did. And I would also say, without even knowing the word, it wasn't in common use, the current day word of sustainability, how you maintain a park, the expense we go through to maintain parks. He was really an advocate of what I call native plant material to a degree, and sustainability, because his parks actually, this is a beautiful pavilion, but his parks did not have that much architecture. They had green space, they had trees that were intended to grow to their perfect size. So in a way, his parks are like museums of trees. They're meant to be the key stars of the landscape. You don't have elaborate flower beds that need a lot of maintenance. All of those, we call them the smalls that need attention. His parks have a sustainable quality to them that can be maintained at a lesser expense, let's say, than Grand Fulmer parks with flower-lined paths, which can be beautiful. For example, the Boston Public Garden is very beautiful, lots of flower beds, but they also have a private friends group that maintains that. So if you're going to design huge parks, though, that won't have friends groups per se, I mean, every park can have a friends group, but when you begin to get vast amounts of land, how do you, in a practical, common sense, sustainable way, design for sustainability? His parks are the answer. He was called to San Francisco to consult on Golden Gate Park, and he ended up not doing it, not working for them, because the San Franciscans wanted a central park there, but he said, there's too much sand here on the Pacific coast. He advised on certain kinds of plant material. They didn't want that. They wanted an East Coast park. So they ended up having to build the park up. It's a magnificent park. But it's an early instance in his letters back and forth of what he was advocating for greater sustainability. His letters are on deposit at the Library of Congress. The drawings that he did and his sons did are both at the Library of Congress and at the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, which is in Brookline, Massachusetts. And a lot of the images are now online, complete public access. Some of them are small scratches, sketches, which I think is great because you have the view of the architect, meaning you see him designing his curving paths, literally almost like on a napkin, you know? So that you're seeing the idea develop, and then you're seeing the fully rendered plans where he carefully places every tree. In conclusion, if you follow this park, so you have the great church there, you have the green space, the playing field, then you come down, and actually the place opens up. There is still the one line of trees around the edge of the park, but imagine there were 3 rows of trees on each side of the park. So you had a real buffer between yourself and the street. And then as you come to the pavilion, then boom, the hill goes down. You have trees along the side. You have maple, oak, locust, sycamore, a whole different grouping. That's a sycamore straight ahead of us with that whitish bark. Sometimes it's known as a London plane tree. But again, you see there's an open field beyond us, so you have an undisturbed view. Then you look out to the bay. And Frederick Law Olmsted must approve what I have to say because he's allowed the sun to come out at the conclusion of my talk. So that's my lecture. I'd like to thank the Fall River Preservation Society for having me. I'd like to mention a few things too about my interest in landscape. I was literally brought up in a house I can see across the water, which is interesting. I didn't know you could see it from here in Swansea. My grandparents lived in Tiverton near Fogland Point, so I grew up around fields and salt marshes and crawling around historic houses that I didn't even know were historic, which led me to my study of architectural history. I'm interested, though, in buildings, landscapes, and whole historic regions, preserving them in totality. And that's what's really key to me. And I wrote the book on Newport's landscape called America's Eden with that idea in mind of how landscapes tell the story of what humans care about, from the formal garden to the picturesque park to tree collecting to public access to green spaces. And Eden is not a word I made up. In the first geography of the United States, published in 1789, Jedediah Morse wrote of this whole bay system. He was writing specifically about Aquidneck Island, but it could apply right up to here. He said, Aquidneck Island in Newport is healthful and beautiful. It's a northern climate warmed by the Gulf Stream, so you can grow many things in this microclimate. He said, travelers justly call it the Eden of America. So that's the very first geography of our country where we're trying to craft our own cultural identity based on our natural landscape. And so this area is Edenic. And I began to discuss that concept probably 20 years ago until I could finally write the book 5 years ago. And every time my family and I drive around, they go, you know, you're right. It is the Eden of America. So that's my speech. Thank you again. I'm glad to take questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Does anybody have any questions for John?
Or observations?
I'm just fascinated, though, that there was 3 rows of trees around the entire park.
There were. The original plan is online, and if you Google literally just South Park, Frederick Law Olmsted, it will pop up. It comes up on the National Park Service website. It's a beautiful plan in detail.
So I grew up in Fall River. I grew up in Fall River, but then I moved to New York. So it took me coming back to Fall River after 17 years in New York for me to find out that he did Central Park. Central Park was one of my, I don't think I knew a lot about Fall River in my life, and New York really. And Central Park is such an interesting place because there's like Sheep's Meadow, there's like the castle. It was like the craziest place to me. So when I came back here and I found out that he had a connection to Fall River, like I can't tell you how much that like made me realize like there are so many things here that people don't realize is
Yes.
so wonderful about Fall River. But I also enjoy the way he thought about it. It's the same way I think about Fall River. The way he thought about things is like you got to use what you have, enhance the natural. Don't It's just really like
True. The genius of place, as he called it, and. You mentioned something about Central Park. He wanted to create that sense of magic with the
everything's
topography.
magic there.
that
no
you
matter
have.
where you are, and it's like still to this day, it's one of my like I remember not even knowing anything about it because this is before the internet. I know everybody knows what I'm talking about here, and I didn't know. I moved to New York. I didn't know what was in Central Park, but every time I went there, it was always like I was discovering something. And I'm like, this place is crazy.
You know, I should have mentioned Frederick Law Olmsted, as the more I've worked with, you know, famous architectural names in the 19th century, he's really one of the very first, I never say the first because you can always be proved wrong, but really one of the very first people to have a truly national practice. You know, architects were famous and worked in the Northeast, but Olmsted did everything from Central Park, he came to Fall River, Portland, Maine, out to Ohio, to the campus of Stanford University in California. So that's a real national practice. And in each place, he respected the diversity of America's climate.
Really, really special, honestly.
That's early. He designed the fairgrounds for the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. So imagine the different locales, you know, he's working in. He worked in private, grand estates, and public parks. And one thing I should say, working in Newport, because I worked for the Preservation Society for many, many years, who own 11 historic houses in Newport, you know, the Breakers and Marble House and such. What landscape designers were doing in the great, you know, Gilded Age dream houses, they were also figuring out at the same time what to do in public parks. It was the same idea, you know? And so this really are parks for a vast demographic, not just the private realm of the few. So he did it all. Parkway, park. And I also should have mentioned the term landscape architect. He's the one who starts to use that term because he wants to professionalize the practice. You know, architects were just seen as contractor, builder, tradespeople, not fine artists. Richard Morris Hunt, who's the first American to be educated in Paris, comes back in the 1860s, and he really establishes the architecture profession in the United States as something that's seen as an artist. Frederick Olmsted, who works with Hunt on several properties, will do the same thing. They were called sort of garden makers, nothing wrong with those things, but he raises the profession, and the American Society of Landscape Architects is finally founded in 1899. At the height of his career. So it's that professional organization again. So he had such an impact. And then the next generation, like Gifford Pinchot, who works for the National Park Service, you know, will be influenced by that as well. I think he's a real lesson though, because now that we're in the middle of climate change and we're in all of the aspect of just low carbon footprints in design, everything Olmsted practiced is still really applicable, and it can be done, I shouldn't say even better, but even more effectively with modern technology.
What I think of the parcel of our parks.
Yeah.
Parcel, this giant huge parcel, and the other parcel, Central Park, and then the surrounding buildings. Was it planned to leave an empty spot and build around it, or?
This was open land acquired for the purpose, Jim, if that's what you're saying, asking. It was.
They specifically didn't build knowing that they were gonna.
That's right. And actually, if most of the buildings here came after the park, the yellowish house with that mansard roof, if you see, that was here. The houses up the park, the row houses, were just about being built. So this was really countryside. North Park, the land was put aside. Again, people really hadn't built on it yet, so the city acquired that land at a cheaper price. So they said you have to design a park there.
I saw a photo somewhere on Facebook somewhere of North Park at the top where Highland Avenue is. There's all cows at the top of the field. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's pretty interesting.
But sometimes the parks
you
will.
can see the Japanese house.
The Japanese house,
Yeah,
by the Boston architect.
On the top of the field.
Yeah, and some parks, though, were cleaning up a mess, meaning Central Park covered everything from, oh goodness, polluted rivers to decaying buildings. So the park movement could also be a part of a big urban cleanup. In this case, it was open space, but it was. You know, one shame is the New York Public Library is a beautiful building, but they actually demolished a beautiful Egyptian revival temple, which was a water reservoir. It's called the Current Reservoir. And you know, not here, but Central Park has a lot of water collection. a functionality to it as well for the city originally. So it was function as well as pleasure. So again, he really thought through that. There was another architect, landscape designer. Frederick Olmsted was very good to work with. He very much was an artist, but he wasn't temperamental. He was very good working with cities, commissions, and the Central Park design was up and down. It was a tough road to travel with all the city involved. It was political, but he got along well with that. Ernest Bowditch was, I call him the cranky Yankee from Salem. He worked in a lot of parks near Olmsted, and he once said, architects are selfish. They know nothing about grading, but they try to invade my garden space. He was always like that. Whereas Frederick was saying the garden can enhance the building and should be elevated to the same level. That's a much more diplomatic approach, you know? Very good.
Any other questions for John?
Yeah, I'm curious, did he do anything in Europe or outside of the States?
He didn't do anything outside of the States that I can recall, but I should have mentioned this. In 1851, he made a trip to England, and he saw one of the earliest public parks in England in Liverpool called Birkenhead Park, and that was really inspirational for him as well. So that's when he really formed his idea of how a park could serve people of all income levels and backgrounds, his time in Liverpool, sketching abroad. I'm almost sure he didn't do anything in Canada. I would have to see. He did hundreds and hundreds of projects. But from what I can recall, he was I think his work was US based. Yeah.
They made Mount Royal in Montreal.
And I don't know if he did that or not. I'd have to check on the 1,000-page Library of Congress website. Because it really does, it's very extensive.
Did he do Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge?
He did. Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge is an early example of what's called the rural cemetery movement. So he did not do that. That's early. That's the 1830s. But picturesque, though. That idea of the curving paths, very hilly. You have the idea of the rural cemetery begins in Europe in the late 18th century. Romantic again, rather than straight paths, hilly sites. Also there you have the Great Sphinx, which is the emancipation symbol for the emancipation of the enslaved in the park. But that was very much, there were rural cemeteries in Brooklyn, very famous. Actually, Oak Grove Cemetery, there's people who know far more about cemeteries than I do, but it's also part of that because they treat the cemetery like a garden. He didn't do as many cemeteries, but he did work on them. He really specialized in parks, what we would call, I'll call it residential development, and parkways. Very good. Well, thank you again. It's a pleasure.